Before we begin this episode, I wanted to put out a disclaimer. The episode you're about to listen to was recorded before the lawsuit and allegations were made public against Vince McMahon, and all mentions on this episode and in the series going forward of the former CEO of WWE are made purely for historical context. I take topics like that covered in the lawsuit very seriously and don't want to make light of those issues. Thank you for understanding, and thank you for listening.
Monday Night Raw is upon us, with 3 episodes from the Manhattan Center taking us into and out of the 1993 Royal Rumble. A new era begins and a Federation career comes to an end as we enter the calm before the war. Hello and welcome to The Calm Before the War, a series dedicated to looking at the first 2 years of Monday Night Raw. I'm Alex Smiley, and this time around we enter a new era as the Federation presents a wrestling show that is uncut, uncooked, and uncensored. We open up the first ever Raw outside the Manhattan Center, where Sean Mooney talks about the massive fans who were braving the elephants earlier today. He is interrupted by the arrival of Bobby Heenan, trying desperately to get into Raw after his run as a host came to an end, with Primetime Wrestling going away the week before. "I don't care about Rob Bartlett" is a sentiment quickly shared with many fans watching this episode of Raw. With that, we go to our opening match with Yokozuna in action. Bartlett quickly becomes jarring and frankly grating on commentary, constantly putting down the man who would soon become a top heel in the company. And his opponent brings some high energy as Coco Beware enters the ring. The match itself was fine enough, though I find myself up and down on Rob's commentary. "He's got his own no-fly zone" was probably the funniest thing I caught from this opening match. Almost as funny as Vince asking Rob what he thinks after the match is over. Up next, they play a pre-taped promo where Bobby Heenan hypes up Narcissus as someone who's better than perfect in coming to the Royal Rumble. Worth noting, they played this across different WWF shows at the time. It's just funny to see it happen on Raw when he's trying to get into the building. Steiner Brothers are in action next, with a nice appearance by the clown we now know as Doink, or Dork, as Rob manages to confuse Vince into saying. It's a very short match, but a nice showcase of what the Steiners can do as they gear up for a collision with the Beverly Brothers at the Royal Rumble pay-per-view. From there, we go back outside where Bobby Heenan tries to get into the Manhattan Center dressed as Rob Bartlett's aunt, and when confronted by Sean Mooney about it, tries to sell his earrings and everything to get a ticket in. Up next, we have a nice promo from Razor Ramon ahead of his WWF Championship match against Bret Hart at the Royal Rumble. And then we get an Intercontinental Championship match. Oh boy, this is gonna be... Oh, it's Max Moon. Wait, no. This match between Max and Shawn Michaels is actually pretty nice. I especially like the hammerlock into a pinning combination from Max Moon. As a matter of fact, this match deserved better than the commentary it got, which included a weird Mike Tyson bit from Rob Bartlett. Shawn wins and retains the belt. Up next, we have a fun little Rumble report segment featuring promos from some of the guys that'll be in the match. Jim Duggan gives us a sad truth when he says, "I'm not guaranteeing I'm gonna win." Raw's debut gives us the first phrase that pays for this series, with Bobby Heenan channeling his inner rabbi to call Rob Bartlett a good bagel as he tries once more to sneak his way into the Manhattan Center. Our main event is a match that would have fit right at home on Superstars, as The Undertaker takes on Damien Demento. I took basically 0 notes on this match. Taker wins, but we're not done with the show just yet. We're just about done with the night as we have an interview between Vince and Doink, who we saw at ringside a couple times throughout the night. The interview is interrupted by Crush, who gives out to the clown for making kids cry before getting shot with a water pistol, leading to the big man chasing after the jester before going into the ring to end things. The last thing we see on this first ever Raw is Sean Mooney giving Bobby Heenan the good news that he can go up into where they're having the show, without telling the Brain it's because the show is over.
Whether it's a heel turn from someone you once trusted, or your job is keeping you in a headlock, life can best be explained through pro wrestling. So why not let everyone else know what's up? Get your Wrestling Explains It All t-shirts from the Occupy Pro Wrestling shop at brainbustertees.com, along with caps and more.
We kick off the go-home for the Royal Rumble inside the Manhattan Center, where Rob Bartlett leans into this little feud he seems to have with Bobby Heenan by referencing the Shannon O'Connor incident from SNL the previous year. Before we get too much further into the show, the Repo Man blindsides Macho Man before running off with his hat. Terry, not the Red Rooster Taylor, is in the ring for our opening match, set to take on Mr. Perfect, in what turned out to be pretty decent. A nice display from Taylor, but it was definitely a backdrop to the feud between Perfect and Ric Flair. On commentary, Savage does not put up with much of Rob's nonsense because he is still heated over Repo Man taking his hat. I hear vintage Ric Flair, and I feel like somewhere a young Michael Cole is taking notes. Side note, the Mr. Perfect vs. Ric Flair feud is a fascinating one to me. It predates Raw by a number of months, so we're coming up on the tail end of a storyline that helped bring Mr. Perfect back into active competition at Survivor Series 1992 and culminates in, well, we'll get to that later. I've earmarked this as the subject of a future video for OPW, so be on the lookout for that. Up next is an interview as Vince talks to Brett about his WWF Championship match at the Rumble against Razor Ramon, with the Hitman talking about Ramon attacking his brother and slapping his father in the face. I reckon this match will be a fun one. Up next, Marty Jannetty is in action against Glenn Ruth, and it's a decent little match, but the main focus is on Shawn Michaels calling in to give Marty some grief ahead of their Intercontinental Championship match at the Rumble. Next, we get a look back at Superstars when Crush was attacked by Doink with a fake arm, a big moment that could have been on this program, but we haven't gotten to the era of Raw being the flagship show just yet. So instead, this is the Lugs Boot of the Week of 1993 Raw. The segment wraps up with Savage saying that fake arm might have been filled with lead, and there is talk of Crush suffering a concussion that's brought up by Vince. Outside, Sean Mooney has found the Repo Man who has Randy's hat, claiming the Macho Man is late on payments for his hat. Repo says Randy deserves the attack before we go to a shot of Savage looking for revenge. We get a challenge for a New York street fight from the Macho Man, a number of years before we actually see street fights as a match stipulation in the Federation. And after a Royal Rumble report, we see Savage chasing after Repo Man out on the streets of New York. Back at ringside, we get our main event between Tito Santana and Ric Flair, two former champs from a past era. Vince flat out lies to us on commentary by saying Tito Santana could win the Royal Rumble, and Savage gives someone in WCW ideas by telling Bartlett, sometimes you can have World War III. Bartlett, for his part, manages to crap all over two future WWE Hall of Famers, and such is the state of the Federation in 1993. Here comes Mr. Perfect, and there goes the match. What a bummer, at least until Flair lays down the challenge for next week's Raw. Flair vs. Perfect, loser leaves WWF, and Perfect accepts to close the show out.
Hey you! Yeah, you! If you haven't already, come check out the central hub for all things Occupy Pro Wrestling at OccupyProWrestling.com, your home for videos, podcasts, merch, and the OPW community.
The third episode of Raw was originally taped January 18th, following the previous night's episode, and aired January 25th, the night after the 1993 Royal Rumble. Because of this, I will only be talking about the Rumble itself as it pertains to what's brought up on this episode of Raw. With that, we kick off the post-Rumble Raw from the streets of New York, where Sean Mooney is interrupted by the arrival of Repoooo in a tow truck. He's got Randy's hat and he promises to repossess the Macho Man's career tonight. We cut inside the Manhattan Center and look who managed to get inside. Bobby Heenan joins Rob Bartlett and Vince McMahon on commentary tonight, partly to fill in for Savage before his match, and partly to be at ringside for the main event. They put over the importance of Ric Flair taking on Mr. Perfect, with Heenan stating that the WWF is not big enough for both men. First match of the night sees Repoooo head to the ring, only to be blindsided by an enraged Randy Savage. Even in a match such as this, Savage shows off the skills and talent that made him a former world champion, and we get a vague mention of what happened at the Rumble, when Vince refers to Savage going after Repoooo during the match, though notably mentions not the fact that Randy was the last one eliminated, or how he was eliminated. I found that to be an interesting mention on commentary, given when this show was taped. Throughout the surprisingly competitive match, Heenan starts ripping into Bartlett, and the world is healing. Savage picks up the win and gets his hat back in the process. Good stuff to kick off the show. There's a little bit of hype here for Headlock for Hunger, which makes me want to track down this fan cam that I keep hearing about. And then there's some hype for WrestleMania 9 before we get to our next match, which is not nearly as competitive as the opening match. Kamala takes on the Brooklyn Brawler, and I swear, Brawler just seems like he'd be a shoo-in for one of Kamala's former handlers, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Kamala wins, and Slick cuts a promo post-match to help continue the storyline they've been running for the Ugandan Giant. Up next is the post-Rumble report, just about the only other reference to what went down at the pay-per-view the night before. No pictures, no footage, just a rundown from me Gene on some of what went down. And now, with 2 matches out of the way, it's time for the main event. The match that follows is so good that any sort of recap on my end would give it no justice whatsoever. It's a really good match, a strong main event for this episode of Raw, and features some awesome spots throughout. Heenan messes around at times at ringside, consulting with Flair and being spotted with a hammer, which he claims he took from Timekeeper. You might have noticed that I've had nothing to point out from Rob's commentary, and that's because this match was so good even he knows better than to say anything dumb. Meanwhile, a young Bryson Remsburg is excited to see Earl Hebner kick Flair's legs off the ropes when he's trying to steal a pin. This Raw main event could have easily been on a pay-per-view at the time, and considering the backstage situation where the Federation was writing off Flair on short notice, the opportunity allows Raw a chance to play into the idea that anything can happen. Perfect manages to catch Flair with the perfect plex for the pin and the win. Flair takes the L en route to his grand return to WCW.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Adrenaline and my nerves. I can't believe it's not a swerve. And if you agree, we've got just the merch for you. Check out the OPW shop at brainbustertees.com for shirts, caps, and more to let the people know how you feel. Whoa!
All in all, the first 3 weeks of Raw make for a nice little arc going into and out of the Royal Rumble. Some growing pains are noticeable as the Federation still relies on its syndicated programming for much of the storyline progression, but we see the culmination of at least one storyline that carries over from a previous era. We're still months away from what would become the new generation, but we are definitely on the winding road that takes us there. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Calm Before the War. Looking at the first 3 weeks of Monday Night Raw was a fun experience, and next time we start down the road to WrestleMania 9 with the return of Brutus Beefcake, a look at the might of Yokozuna, and let me tell you something, brother. Thanks to Josh Inez of Inez X for the sweet 80s remix of the Monday Night Raw theme song to open and close the podcast. Josh is from the Northwest Indiana and Chicagoland area and has some awesome work in music, photography, and more across his YouTube and other social medias at InezX. Until next time, I'm Alex Smiley, and this has been The Calm Before the War.